My wife said Derek was just helping her study for nursing school, but when I found his jacket draped over our living room chair after another one of their late-night study sessions, I knew something wasn't adding up. The jacket was expensive, some designer brand that definitely didn't match the budget of a typical nursing student, and it smelled like cologne that definitely wasn't mine. I should mention that I'm Jake, 34, and I work as an industrial automation specialist here in Indianapolis, basically designing and maintaining the computer systems that run manufacturing plants across the Midwest. It's detail-oriented work that's taught me to notice when systems deviate from their expected patterns, when data doesn't align with what it should be showing. That analytical mindset served me well professionally, but it was about to reveal something in my personal life that I wasn't prepared to face. I'd been married to Amber for 6 years, and she decided 2 years ago to go back to school for nursing, which I completely supported both emotionally and financially. I was proud of her ambition to make a difference in healthcare, and I'd restructured our entire budget to cover her tuition, books, and living expenses so she could focus on her studies without the stress of working. The program was notoriously demanding, with clinical rotations at various hospitals around Indianapolis, intensive study requirements, and the constant pressure of maintaining grades high enough to eventually land a position at one of the better medical centers in the city. When she first started mentioning Derek from her nursing cohort, I didn't think much of it. Nursing school created tight bonds between classmates who were all struggling through the same challenging curriculum together. Derek was apparently a few years older, had some prior medical experience, and was helping Amber through the particularly challenging pediatric rotation that was known for breaking students who couldn't handle the emotional demands of working with sick children. Amber would come home exhausted but talking about how Derek really understood the material and had this gift for explaining complex medical concepts in ways that clicked for her, and honestly, I was grateful someone was helping her succeed in something she was so passionate about. But gradually, the nature of their interactions started shifting in ways that made me increasingly uncomfortable. The study sessions moved from the nursing school library to coffee shops around town, then to weekend meetings at his apartment that Amber claimed were necessary because Derek had all the best study materials and reference books. The conversations about Derek became more personal, how he'd had this difficult divorce a few years back, how he understood the pressure she was under better than anyone, how he'd encouraged her to stand up for herself more in clinical settings where some of the older nurses could be dismissive of students. Then came the late-night phone calls that would have her whispering in the bathroom or stepping out onto our back patio, claiming Derek needed help with assignments or had urgent questions about their shared clinical schedule at the children's hospital. When I finally worked up the courage to mention that these calls seemed pretty frequent and personal for study buddies, Amber's response shocked me with its sudden intensity and defensiveness. She accused me of being paranoid and controlling, saying I clearly didn't understand how demanding her program was and that Derek was simply a good friend who was helping her get through the most difficult part of her education. The argument escalated quickly when I pointed out that she'd never mentioned other classmates calling her at 11 p.m. to discuss pediatric dosage calculations, and she shot back that maybe the real problem was my jealousy and complete inability to trust her judgment as an adult. I tried to explain calmly that I wasn't trying to control her friendships or monitor her every interaction, but that the secrecy around these particular conversations felt fundamentally different from her normal study group activities with other students in her cohort. That's when she really exploded, accusing me of snooping on her personal relationships and monitoring her every move like some kind of controlling prison warden who couldn't handle his wife having male friends. She insisted that Derek was single-handedly helping her maintain her GPA and that my constant suspicions and accusations were actively jeopardizing her academic success, somehow making me feel like the villain for even bringing up what seemed like reasonable concerns about appropriate boundaries. The situation reached a devastating breaking point when I discovered something that made my stomach drop: dozens of deleted text messages between Amber and Derek on our shared phone bill. Messages sent and received at all hours of the day and night, that somehow never appeared on her actual phone whenever I happened to glimpse it during normal conversations. When I gathered the courage to mention this discovery, hoping against hope for some reasonable explanation that would put my fears to rest, Amber absolutely exploded in a way I'd never witnessed in our entire relationship. She screamed that I was invading her privacy, that checking our phone bill was a fundamental violation of trust between married partners, and that my increasingly controlling behavior was exactly why she needed Derek's emotional support and guidance in the first place. She packed an overnight bag with shaking hands while continuing to yell about my paranoia, announcing that she was staying at her sister's house for several days because she literally couldn't handle being around my constant suspicion and what she called my toxic, controlling behavior anymore. As she stormed toward the front door with her bag in hand, she turned back with tears in her eyes and delivered what felt like a crushing blow. Derek had actually warned her that some husbands couldn't handle their wives becoming more independent and successful, and that maybe he was absolutely right about me after all. I stood alone in our suddenly quiet living room, staring at that expensive jacket still draped casually over our leather chair, realizing with growing dread that either I was completely losing my mind with unfounded paranoia, or my wife of 6 years was having an affair and systematically gaslighting me into believing that I was the real problem in our marriage. Instead of continuing to chase Amber with accusations and arguments that only made me look more controlling, I decided to take a completely different approach. I became quietly observant while maintaining our normal routines in our suburban Indianapolis home on Maple Street, where we'd lived for the past 4 years in what I'd always considered our safe haven from the world. During those 3 days while she stayed at her sister's place, I used the silence to think clearly about what I'd actually observed versus what I'd assumed, and I realized that my engineering background had taught me something valuable. When a complex automation system isn't working properly, you don't start randomly replacing components, you gather comprehensive data, analyze patterns, and identify the root cause before you make any repairs. When Amber returned home with puffy eyes and a subdued demeanor, apologizing for overreacting and insisting that Derek was just a friend who understood the pressures of nursing school better than I could, I accepted her explanation with a calm nod and told her I wanted to support her education however I could. But privately, I started documenting patterns with the same methodical approach I used for troubleshooting industrial control systems at work, creating a detailed log of her behaviors, schedules, and inconsistencies that I kept locked in my home office filing cabinet. I began noting the exact times she left for what she claimed were clinical rotations versus when she actually returned home, tracking the frequency and duration of her phone calls with Derek, documenting changes in her mood and behavior after their supposed study sessions, and paying careful attention to any new details she mentioned about her program that I could independently verify. What I discovered over the following 2 weeks made my stomach sink with a terrible certainty that felt like watching a machine malfunction in slow motion. Derek's car, a black Honda Civic with distinctive racing stripes that I'd memorized from the one time he'd picked Amber up for what she claimed was a group project, was frequently parked near her clinical sites during hours that didn't remotely align with her actual schedule at the Children's Hospital downtown. I started taking slightly longer lunch breaks to drive past these locations, using different routes and timing to avoid detection, and twice I spotted them having what looked like intimate conversations in his car, sitting much closer than study partners should, with body language that suggested far more familiarity than professional collaboration. Even more concerning, I discovered through careful observation and some discreet online research that Amber had been attending yoga classes at a trendy studio downtown that she'd never mentioned to me in any of our conversations about her daily activities. These classes, according to the studio's detailed online schedule that I studied extensively, happened to coincide perfectly with Derek's free time between his own clinical rotations at different hospitals around the city. When I casually asked about her new interest in yoga during dinner one evening, trying to keep my tone light and supportive, she claimed without hesitation that she'd been going to the campus gym for stress relief and meditation, which was clearly a calculated lie since I'd called the campus recreation center the next day and confirmed she hadn't checked in there in over 3 months. The deception was becoming systematic and sophisticated, requiring advanced planning and coordination that went far beyond a casual friendship or even an emotional affair that had gotten slightly out of hand. This was a deliberate, ongoing betrayal that involved creating elaborate cover stories and maintaining multiple false narratives. Rather than confronting her with this new evidence and risking another explosive argument that would only put her on guard and potentially drive the affair further underground, I made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely necessary for protecting my future. I contacted a private investigator who specialized in matrimonial surveillance. My divorce attorney colleague from our monthly engineering networking group at the downtown Marriott had mentioned a guy named Rodriguez who ran a discreet investigative firm and had experience with adultery cases, and after a brief but thorough consultation in his office near Monument Circle, I hired him to conduct comprehensive surveillance on both Amber and Derek for 2 weeks. The retainer was expensive, $3,500 that I had to carefully extract from our joint savings account without raising suspicion by spacing out the withdrawals over several days and using our emergency fund that Amber rarely checked, but I needed concrete, legally admissible proof of what was happening before I made any life-changing decisions that could affect my financial security and reputation. Rodriguez, a former Indianapolis police detective with 20 years of experience, confirmed my worst fears within just 5 days of starting his surveillance operation. The detailed photographs and meticulously documented reports he provided showed Amber and Derek entering Derek's apartment complex on the north side of the city together on multiple occasions when she was supposed to be at clinical rotations, staying for hours at a time in situations that clearly weren't related to studying, and engaging in obviously romantic behavior including passionate kissing, intimate hand-holding, and prolonged embraces in his car and outside various restaurants around the city where they'd apparently been having regular dinner dates. But rather than rushing home to confront her with this devastating evidence and potentially sabotaging my legal position, I made what felt like the smartest decision I'd made in months. I began quietly and systematically preparing for the inevitable end of my marriage. I started liquidating joint assets by gradually transferring funds to accounts that only I controlled, researching divorce attorneys who specialized in adultery cases under Indiana's fault-based divorce laws that could work in my favor, preparing comprehensive separation documents with the help of legal counsel, and creating detailed financial records that would protect me during property division proceedings. I even began looking for a new place to live, visiting extended-stay hotels and short-term rental properties during my lunch breaks and after work, all while Amber continued coming home each evening with elaborate stories about her challenging pediatric rotation and how incredibly grateful she was for Derek's patient tutoring sessions that were supposedly helping her maintain her grades. The hardest part wasn't the surveillance or the legal preparation or even the financial planning. It was sitting across from her at our kitchen table each night, listening to her elaborate lies about her day while I knew exactly where she'd been, who she'd been with, and what she'd been doing for hours at a time when she was supposed to be caring for sick children at the hospital. On a Tuesday morning when Amber left for what she claimed was a particularly demanding clinical rotation at the children's hospital that would require her to stay late for additional patient care training, I executed my carefully planned exit strategy with the kind of military precision that my engineering background had taught me to value above emotional impulses. I'd been rehearsing this moment in my mind for weeks, timing every step down to the minute, and I knew I had exactly 8 hours before she would return home expecting to find her unsuspecting husband waiting with dinner and sympathetic questions about her exhausting day of supposedly caring for sick children. The first step was financial protection. I transferred the remaining $23,400 from our joint savings account to my personal checking account that I'd opened at a different bank across town, leaving just enough money to cover the automatic mortgage payment that would be due in 10 days so the bank wouldn't immediately flag any irregularities. I also moved $8,200 from our joint checking account, which represented my contributions over the past 6 months plus the money I'd saved by quietly liquidating some of my personal investments without her knowledge. I left her access to about $1,800 in the joint checking account, which seemed fair considering she'd contributed virtually nothing to our household finances while I'd been supporting her nursing school dreams for the past 2 years. Then came the physical logistics that I'd practiced during my lunch breaks. I loaded my essential belongings into the rental truck I'd picked up at 6 a.m. from the U-Haul location downtown, including my clothes, important documents, electronics, family photos that were meaningful to me personally, and the expensive tools from my home workshop that represented years of careful collecting and substantial financial investment. I left behind all the furniture we'd bought together, the wedding gifts from both our families, and anything that could be considered jointly owned, because I wanted to be absolutely certain that she couldn't later claim I'd stolen marital property during my departure. The most satisfying moment came when I placed the divorce papers that my attorney had prepared on our kitchen counter, arranged next to the folder containing printed photographs from Rodriguez's surveillance operation that showed Amber and Derek in various compromising positions around the city. I included copies of the phone records showing their deleted text message conversations, printouts of the yoga studio's class schedule that proved her lies about going to the campus gym, and a detailed timeline of her deceptions that I'd compiled with the same thoroughness I brought to analyzing industrial automation problems at work. I also left a brief note that simply stated, "The evidence speaks for itself. My attorney will be in contact within 48 hours. Do not attempt to contact me directly." I drove my loaded rental truck to the extended stay hotel I'd already reserved on the other side of Indianapolis, a clean and comfortable place near my office that offered monthly rates and would give me time to find a permanent apartment without the pressure of hasty decisions made during emotional turmoil. After checking in and beginning to organize my temporary living space, I took care of the final logistical details that would ensure my complete separation from Amber's ability to manipulate or contact me. I changed my cell phone number through my carrier's online portal, updated my address with my bank, credit cards, and employer's HR department, and modified my direct deposit information to ensure my paychecks would go to accounts that only I controlled. However, I deliberately kept our shared home security system linked to my new phone, because I wanted to monitor exactly when Amber returned home and witnessed the destruction of the fantasy life she'd been living at my expense for months. The smart home system we'd installed the previous year included cameras at the front door, motion sensors throughout the house, and smartphone alerts that would tell me precisely when she discovered my departure and the evidence of her affair. I spent the afternoon setting up my temporary office space in the hotel room, connecting my laptop to the secure Wi-Fi network, and preparing to work remotely for the next few days while the initial shock of my departure settled. Around 3 p.m., I sent a single text message to Amber's number that I knew she'd see when she checked her phone during her supposed clinical rotation. "Check the kitchen counter when you get home, then call Derek. You'll both want to hear what I have to say about your future." I didn't explain what she'd find or why Derek needed to be involved, because I wanted her to discover the evidence naturally and react authentically without having time to prepare her responses or coordinate her story with her lover. The beauty of my plan was that she'd been so confident in her deception, so certain that I was the naive and trusting husband who would never catch on to her sophisticated lies, that she'd have no prepared strategy for dealing with concrete evidence of her betrayal. I settled into my hotel room with a sense of calm determination, knowing that within a few hours, Amber would return home expecting to continue her double life, only to discover that her world had completely collapsed while she was supposedly caring for pediatric patients. The next phase of my plan would depend entirely on how she and Derek reacted to being exposed, but I was confident that people who had built their relationship on lies and deception wouldn't handle the pressure of public accountability with grace or dignity. I ordered takeout from a restaurant I'd always wanted to try but never could because Amber always insisted on places that fit her image of sophisticated dining, opened a beer that I'd bought specifically for this moment, and waited for the security system notifications that would tell me my marriage was officially over. When Amber discovered the evidence and divorce papers scattered across our kitchen counter at exactly 6:47 p.m. according to the motion sensor alerts on my phone, she immediately called Derek in what I can only describe as complete panic and desperation, and thanks to our smart home system that I still controlled remotely through the administrative account she'd never known existed, I was able to listen to every single word of their conversation through the kitchen's voice-activated speaker that remained connected to my personal account. The first thing I heard was Amber's voice, trembling with terror and disbelief, frantically explaining to Derek that I'd somehow discovered their affair and had left comprehensive photographic evidence of their relationship along with formal divorce papers that meant I was completely serious about ending our 6-year marriage immediately. Derek's initial response revealed his true character and priorities with shocking clarity. Instead of expressing genuine concern for Amber's emotional state or taking any responsibility for his central role in destroying my marriage, he immediately started asking cold, practical questions about what specific evidence I'd gathered, whether any of the photographs showed his face clearly, and if there was any way to minimize the potential damage to his own reputation and career prospects in the competitive nursing field. When Amber read him detailed portions of Rodriguez's surveillance report that documented their activities at his apartment on Meridian Street, their romantic dinners at upscale restaurants around downtown Indianapolis, and their intimate physical moments in his car outside various locations throughout the city. Derek's voice became increasingly agitated and defensive rather than supportive or loving toward the woman he'd supposedly been patiently helping through her challenging pediatric nursing program. I could hear Amber shuffling through the papers and photographs, describing each piece of damning evidence while her voice broke with the realization that her secret relationship had been completely exposed and documented with professional thoroughness. Then came the revelation that would shatter whatever remaining illusions Amber might have harbored about Derek's intentions, character, and genuine feelings for her during their months of deception. When she desperately asked him what they were going to do now that their relationship was completely exposed and whether he was prepared to support her emotionally and financially through the inevitable divorce proceedings that would follow, Derek delivered a series of crushing blows that I could hear clearly through the smart speaker system I'd strategically left active. He admitted with brutal, calculated honesty that he'd been systematically lying to Amber about virtually every important aspect of his life, his intentions, and his availability from the very first day they'd met in their nursing cohort at the university. Derek confessed with shocking callousness that he was actually married to a woman named Linda who was currently recovering from major surgery to remove a potentially fatal brain tumor, and that he had 2 young children aged 6 and 8 who had absolutely no idea their father was conducting an affair with a fellow nursing student while their mother fought for her life in intensive care at University Hospital. The conversation revealed the sophisticated web of lies that Derek had constructed to maintain his double life. He'd been telling his sick wife Linda that he was working overtime shifts and extra clinical rotations to pay for her mounting medical bills and experimental treatments, while simultaneously convincing Amber that I was an emotionally abusive and controlling husband who didn't appreciate her intelligence, ambition, or potential for success in the healthcare field. I listened in growing fascination and anger as Derek cruelly explained to the increasingly hysterical Amber that she had been nothing more than a convenient and easily manipulated sexual outlet during an extremely stressful period in his life when his wife was too sick from chemotherapy treatments to meet his physical and emotional needs. He told her with devastating honesty that he'd never had any serious intention of leaving his family or building a genuine long-term relationship with her, and that he'd simply enjoyed the ego boost and temporary escape that came from having a younger, more attractive woman worship him and believe he was more sophisticated, successful, and worthy than her supposedly boring and unappreciative husband. Derek's words became increasingly vicious and psychologically cruel as Amber's desperation and emotional breakdown intensified, and he actually told her that she'd been pathetically easy to manipulate and control because she was so obviously starving for male attention, validation, and approval that she'd believe whatever lies he told her about her marriage, her worth as a person, and her prospects for finding someone better than me. The most psychologically damaging part of their conversation came when Derek admitted with clinical detachment that he'd specifically targeted and pursued Amber because he'd carefully observed her obvious insecurity, neediness, and vulnerability during their first few interactions in their advanced pediatric care class, and that he deliberately undermined her confidence in our marriage by constantly suggesting that I didn't appreciate her properly, didn't support her career ambitions adequately, and that she deserved significantly better treatment than what she was receiving in our supposedly stable and loving home. I recorded every devastating word of this conversation on my phone, realizing that Derek's detailed confession would not only be extremely useful evidence in my divorce proceedings under Indiana's fault-based adultery laws, but would also provide absolutely devastating material that could completely destroy his nursing career, his marriage to his sick wife, and his reputation throughout the entire Indianapolis medical community where character, ethics, and professional behavior were supposedly fundamental requirements for advancement and respect. Armed with the complete recording of Derek's devastating confession and Rodriguez's comprehensive surveillance evidence, I arranged to meet both Amber and Derek the following evening at a neutral coffee shop downtown called Greystone Cafe, deliberately choosing a public location where they couldn't create a dramatic scene or attempt to manipulate the situation through emotional outbursts or accusations of harassment. I sent a simple text message to both of their phones that afternoon stating I would be there at 7 p.m. and that they needed to attend together if they wanted any chance of minimizing the consequences of their affair for their respective futures, careers, and reputations. When they arrived looking haggard and defeated, Amber with red, swollen eyes from crying and Derek wearing an expensive suit that seemed designed to project authority he clearly didn't possess, I was already seated at a corner table with a detailed evidence folder organized with the same methodical precision I brought to engineering projects at work. My calm demeanor and professional appearance clearly surprised them both, as they'd probably expected to find me emotionally devastated, angry, or desperate to negotiate some kind of reconciliation that would preserve their secret relationship. Instead, I greeted them with polite acknowledgement and immediately opened the folder to reveal printed photographs of their affair, detailed surveillance reports, phone records documenting their deleted conversations, and transcripts of Derek's recorded confession from the previous evening that revealed his true character and intentions. Derek's immediate reaction was to attempt damage control by throwing Amber completely under the bus, claiming that she had pursued and seduced him despite his initial resistance, and that he'd only responded to her advances because she'd convinced him that her marriage to me was already over and that I'd been emotionally abusive toward her throughout our relationship. When I calmly played the recorded conversation where Derek admitted to specifically targeting Amber because of her vulnerability and deliberately undermining our marriage for his own entertainment, his face went white with the realization that his lies had been completely exposed and documented. Amber finally understood the full scope of Derek's manipulation when she heard his recorded voice explaining how easy she'd been to control and how he'd never intended to build a real relationship with her, and she broke down completely while Derek shifted his strategy to claiming that the recording had been obtained illegally and couldn't be used against him professionally or personally. That's when I delivered the most satisfying part of my carefully planned confrontation. I placed my phone on the table, dialed Derek's wife Linda's number that I'd obtained through the hospital's directory, and put the call on speaker so that everyone in our immediate area could hear Derek's sick wife answer the phone from what sounded like her hospital room. When Linda answered with a weak voice asking why someone was calling her husband's number, I calmly identified myself as Jake, Amber's husband, and explained that I had some important information about Derek's activities during her illness that she needed to hear for her own protection and legal planning. I then played a carefully edited portion of the recorded conversation where Derek admitted to using Amber for sex while Linda was receiving cancer treatments, confessed that he'd been lying about working overtime to pay for medical bills, and revealed that he'd been spending money on romantic dinners and hotel rooms while claiming financial stress from her medical expenses. The silence on Linda's end of the phone lasted for what felt like several minutes before she asked me to send her copies of all the evidence I'd gathered, thanked me for giving her the information she needed to protect herself and her children, and hung up without saying a single word to Derek, who sat frozen in apparent shock at the table. Derek's professional consequences began immediately when I contacted the Human Resources Department at University Hospital the next morning and filed a formal complaint about his inappropriate relationship with a fellow nursing student, which violated the school's code of conduct and professional ethics standards that all healthcare workers were required to maintain. The hospital's investigation moved quickly once I provided them with the photographic evidence, recorded confessions, and detailed timeline of Derek's deceptive behavior, and within a week he was dismissed from the nursing program and banned from clinical rotations at any affiliated medical facilities throughout the Indianapolis healthcare network. Meanwhile, Amber's complete emotional breakdown accelerated when she realized that she'd destroyed her 6-year marriage and lost her primary source of financial support for someone who had never cared about her and was now facing his own divorce proceedings, career destruction, and potential legal action from his wife's attorneys who were already investigating his financial deceptions and adultery during Linda's illness. When Amber finally attempted to beg me for reconciliation, promising to cut all contact with Derek and commit completely to rebuilding our marriage, I responded with the same calm professionalism I'd maintained throughout the entire confrontation, explaining that her choices had permanent consequences and that I'd already filed the divorce papers with the court system, hired an attorney who specialized in adultery cases, and begun building a new life that didn't include someone who could betray. 6 years of marriage for momentary excitement with a manipulative predator who targeted her insecurities. The divorce proceedings moved through the Indiana court system with remarkable efficiency thanks to the comprehensive documentation I'd gathered and the state's fault-based divorce laws that heavily favored the innocent party in cases of proven adultery, giving me significant advantages in property division, spousal support determinations, and asset protection that would have been impossible to achieve in a no-fault divorce scenario. My attorney, Patricia Henley, was a seasoned family law specialist who had handled hundreds of adultery cases and immediately recognized the strength of my evidence package, which included not only Rodriguez's professional surveillance photographs and detailed reports, but also the recorded confession where Derek admitted to deliberately targeting and manipulating Amber while maintaining his own marriage to a seriously ill woman. The combination of photographic evidence, phone records, financial documentation showing how I'd supported Amber's education while she conducted her affair, and Derek's own recorded words created what Patricia called an absolutely bulletproof case that would result in minimal asset distribution to Amber and no requirement for ongoing spousal support payments. Amber received exactly $12,400 from our joint assets, primarily her car loan payoff and half the value of her personal belongings, while I retained ownership of our house, all retirement accounts, investment portfolios, and the savings I'd accumulated during our marriage while supporting her nursing school expenses that had ultimately funded her affair with Derek. The proceedings were completed within 4 months, an unusually fast timeline that reflected both the strength of my evidence and Amber's complete lack of legal standing to contest the fault-based determination that had been clearly established by her documented adultery. Meanwhile, Derek's life imploded with the kind of spectacular completeness that only comes from building your entire existence on lies and manipulation that eventually catch up with you in devastating fashion. Linda's divorce attorney contacted me within 2 weeks of our coffee shop confrontation to thank me personally for providing the evidence that allowed her to secure full custody of Derek and Linda's 2 children, plus substantial spousal support payments that would continue throughout her cancer recovery and potentially for years afterward depending on her long-term medical prognosis and treatment outcomes. Derek also faced professional sanctions from the Indiana State Board of Nursing after Linda's attorney filed formal complaints about his unethical conduct during his nursing school program, citing his inappropriate relationship with a fellow student and his deceptive behavior toward his sick wife as evidence of character deficiencies that made him unsuitable for healthcare work where trust, honesty, and ethical behavior were fundamental requirements. The nursing board's investigation resulted in Derek losing his student nursing license and being permanently banned from enrolling in any accredited nursing programs throughout the state, effectively ending his healthcare career before it had even begun and forcing him to find employment in completely different fields where his damaged reputation wouldn't be as much of a liability. With my divorce finalized and my professional reputation intact, I made the decision to accept a promotion transfer that my company had been offering me for months, a senior automation engineer position at their Phoenix, Arizona facility that came with a substantial salary increase and the opportunity to work on cutting-edge renewable energy projects that aligned perfectly with my long-term career goals and personal interests in sustainable technology. The timing was perfect for a complete fresh start in a new city where nobody knew about my failed marriage or the circumstances that had led to my divorce, allowing me to focus entirely on rebuilding my life according to my own values and priorities rather than trying to accommodate someone else's deception and betrayal. I sold our Indianapolis house within 6 weeks of my divorce being finalized, netting a substantial profit that I used as a down payment on a modern townhouse in Scottsdale with mountain views, upgraded appliances, and a home office space where I could work remotely when needed without being reminded of the lies Amber had told while supposedly studying for her nursing career in our old house. Phoenix offered everything I'd been missing during the final years of my marriage: honest sunshine instead of manufactured drama, outdoor recreation opportunities that didn't require coordinating with someone else's secret schedule, and a thriving professional community of engineers and technology specialists who shared my interests in problem-solving and innovation rather than manipulation and deception. 6 months after moving to Arizona, I met Patricia Chen at a professional conference on industrial automation in renewable energy systems, where she was presenting research on quality control protocols for aerospace manufacturing processes that demonstrated exactly the kind of analytical thinking and attention to detail that I'd always valued in both professional and personal relationships. Patricia was 31, worked as a quality inspector for a major aerospace contractor, and had the refreshing directness and complete transparency about her past relationships that made me realize how much energy I'd wasted trying to decode Amber's lies and manipulation instead of simply enjoying honest communication with someone who had nothing to hide from their partner or agenda to pursue. 2 years later, I learned through mutual friends back in Indianapolis that Amber had never completed her nursing program and was working as a retail manager at a department store in a suburban mall, having gained a reputation throughout our former social circle for creating relationship drama and burning bridges with anyone who questioned her version of events about our divorce. According to Lisa, one of the few people who maintained contact with both of us, Amber had attempted to restart the nursing program twice but dropped out each time due to what she claimed were hostile learning environments and discriminatory treatment from instructors who supposedly had unrealistic expectations for her academic performance and clinical competency. The reality, from what I could piece together through various sources who had witnessed her struggles firsthand, was that Amber had never developed the discipline and work ethic required for healthcare education once she lost the financial support and structured environment that I'd provided during our marriage, and she'd been unable to maintain the focus necessary for the demanding clinical rotations and intensive study requirements that nursing school demanded from students who were serious about their professional development. Lisa also mentioned that Amber had been through several short-term relationships since our divorce, but each one had ended quickly when her new partners realized she was still telling different versions of our marriage breakdown to justify her behavior and avoid taking responsibility for the choices that had led to the destruction of our 6-year relationship. Derek's situation had become even more catastrophic than I'd anticipated when I'd first exposed his deception and manipulation during our coffee shop confrontation 2 years earlier. His marriage to Linda had ended in a costly divorce settlement that left him financially devastated and struggling to maintain his court-ordered child support payments. He'd lost his nursing license permanently and was now working in medical device sales in another state where his damaged reputation wouldn't be as immediately recognizable. And according to Linda's attorney, who occasionally updated me on Derek's ongoing legal obligations, he was facing potential contempt of court charges for falling behind on his spousal support payments while Linda continued her cancer treatments. I genuinely felt satisfied knowing that both Amber and Derek were experiencing the natural consequences of their choices to build a relationship on lies, manipulation, and betrayal of people who had trusted them completely, but I'd reached a point in my emotional recovery where their struggles felt like distant news about people I'd once known rather than sources of ongoing emotional investment or vindictive pleasure. The justice they were experiencing felt complete and appropriate without requiring any additional effort or attention from me, which represented a significant evolution in my thinking from the angry determination I'd felt during the investigation and confrontation phases of ending my marriage. Meanwhile, Patricia and I were engaged and living together in our modern Phoenix townhouse, where I'd learned to trust my instincts about people and situations while valuing the kind of honest communication that Amber had never been capable of providing during our 6 years of marriage. Our relationship had developed naturally based on shared interests, mutual respect, and the kind of transparency that made every day feel refreshing rather than exhausting, and I discovered what it meant to be with someone who actively chose to include me in their decisions rather than manipulating situations to exclude me from important aspects of their life while making me feel controlling for asking reasonable questions. The contrast between my marriage to Amber and my relationship with Patricia was so stark that I sometimes wondered how I'd tolerated the constant uncertainty, secrecy, and emotional manipulation for as long as I had before finally gathering the evidence and courage necessary to end a relationship that had been slowly destroying my sense of reality, self-worth, and ability to trust my own perceptions about suspicious behavior. Patricia's approach to potential relationship challenges was everything that Amber's had not been. When a male colleague from her quality inspection team was assigned to travel with her for a week-long training program at an aerospace facility in Seattle, she immediately discussed the situation with me, included me in conversations about the professional nature of the trip, and proactively addressed any concerns I might have about the arrangement before finalizing her travel plans with her supervisor. Standing in our kitchen one evening while Patricia openly explained the details of her upcoming work travel and asked for my thoughts about the colleague who would be accompanying her, I realized with profound gratitude that I'd learned to recognize and appreciate real partnership, which meant transparency and inclusion rather than accusations of paranoia when reasonable questions were asked about potentially sensitive situations that could affect our relationship. The difference between Patricia's natural impulse to include me in decisions that could affect our relationship and Amber's systematic campaign to exclude me while making me feel controlling for wanting basic information about her activities represented a fundamental shift in my understanding of what healthy relationships actually looked like when both people were committed to honesty, mutual respect, and building trust through consistent actions rather than manipulative words. I'd learned to trust my analytical instincts about people and situations rather than allowing myself to be gaslighted into believing that reasonable concerns about suspicious behavior were evidence of personal inadequacy or controlling tendencies. And I developed the confidence to expect transparency and honesty as basic requirements in any serious relationship rather than luxuries that I should feel grateful to occasionally receive from someone who claimed to love me.